Raid on Saltillo. In the dry northern frontierlands of New Spain, where deserts stretched beneath endless skies and isolated settlements clung to survival, fear often arrived on horseback. The year was the late 1700s. Beyond the fragile Spanish frontier rode the Comanche, fast, organized, relentless. To settlers living near the frontier, the sound of distant hooves could mean disaster. And among the most feared raids of the era was the attack on Saltillo. At the time, Saltillo stood as an important colonial settlement in northern Mexico. It was a crossroads of trade and agriculture, surrounded by ranches, livestock, and supply routes stretching across harsh territory. But wealth on the frontier attracted danger. The Comanche had become masters of mounted warfare. Over generations, they transformed themselves into one of the most powerful horse cultures in North America. Their mobility gave them enormous reach across Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Spanish defenses struggled to respond. Settlements were scattered, soldiers were limited, communication was slow. The Comanche knew the terrain, and they knew exactly when to strike. During raids into northern Mexico, war parties moved quickly across enormous distances, often appearing with little warning before disappearing back into the plains. The raid on Saltillo became part of a larger wave of devastating attacks that reshaped life along the frontier. Livestock were taken, supplies disappeared, settlements lived under constant fear. But these raids were not random acts of violence. For the Comanche, raiding had become deeply tied to survival, power, trade, and resistance against colonial expansion. Horses captured in raids strengthened their influence, weapons and supplies increased their reach. And every successful strike reminded colonial authorities that the frontier remained contested. Spanish officials attempted to build forts, negotiate alliances, and launch military campaigns. Yet the Comanche remained elusive. What terrified frontier settlers most was not simply the violence. It was uncertainty. No one knew where the next raid would fall. Families slept lightly, travelers moved cautiously, and ranches across the frontier began to resemble isolated outposts surrounded by danger. The raid on Saltillo became one more chapter in a larger struggle between expanding colonial settlements and the fiercely independent power of the southern plains. A conflict fought not only with weapons, but with endurance. And for decades, the frontier remained locked in that struggle. The hunt for Cuerno Verde. Across the southern plains, one Comanche leader became legendary among both his people and his enemies. His name was Cuerno Verde, the Greenhorn. He earned the name from the distinctive green buffalo horn he wore into battle. To Spanish settlers and soldiers, Cuerno Verde became a symbol of terror on the frontier. To the Comanche, he represented resistance. By the late 1700s, Comanche raids had intensified across Spanish territory. Ranches were attacked, supply lines disrupted, entire settlements abandoned. Spanish authorities demanded action. That responsibility eventually fell to Juan Bautista de Anza, the governor of New Mexico. Unlike many commanders before him, de Anza understood that defeating the Comanche required mobility and strategy. He studied their movements, tracked their routes, and prepared carefully. In the year 1779, de Anza launched an expedition deep into Comanche territory. His goal was clear: find Cuerno Verde. The campaign moved across difficult terrain beneath punishing conditions. Soldiers and native allies traveled through plains and mountains, searching for signs of the Comanche war leader. Then finally, contact. Near the base of the Rocky Mountains, the two forces met. The battle that followed became one of the most famous clashes between Spanish forces and the Comanche. Cuerno Verde fought fiercely. But this time, the Spanish had prepared well. The Comanche leader was killed during the fighting, along with several members of his family. For Spain, the victory carried enormous symbolic value. One of the frontier's most feared raiders had fallen. But even the death of Cuerno Verde did not end Comanche power. The Comanche remained dominant across much of the southern plains for decades afterward. Yet the battle changed the balance. Afterward, diplomacy slowly increased between Spanish authorities and Comanche leaders. Trade expanded, temporary peace agreements emerged, and for a moment, the frontier grew quieter. Still, the legend of Cuerno Verde endured. Stories spread across settlements about the warrior with the greenhorn helmet who rode fearlessly against colonial forces. In many ways, he became larger than life, not simply a man, but a symbol of the fierce independence of the plains. The Battle of the Black Shield. As the 19th century unfolded, the southern plains entered a new era of conflict. The United States expanded westward, railroads advanced, settlers poured into contested territory, and native nations faced increasing pressure from every direction. Among the warriors resisting this expansion was a figure remembered in frontier stories as Black Shield. The exact details surrounding the Battle of the Black Shield have faded into the blur between history and legend. But accounts describe a violent confrontation tied to the larger struggle for control of the plains. By this time, buffalo populations were collapsing, military forts spread across native territory, and survival itself became uncertain. War parties continued raiding settlements and supply routes. The U.S. military responded with aggressive campaigns designed not simply to win battles, but to break resistance entirely. During the Battle of the Black Shield, mounted warriors fought against advancing military forces in brutal conditions across open country. Dust filled the air, gunfire echoed across the plains, and both sides understood what was truly at stake. For settlers and soldiers, the frontier represented expansion and opportunity. For native nations, it represented survival. The fighting reflected the changing nature of Western warfare. Long gone were the isolated frontier skirmishes of earlier generations. Now the conflict involved repeating rifles, organized cavalry units, and expanding federal power. Yet native fighters still held deep advantages. Knowledge of terrain, mobility, and generations of experience surviving on the plains. Stories surrounding Black Shield describe courage, tactical skill, and fierce resistance against overwhelming pressure. Whether every detail survives accurately no longer matters as much as what the story represents. The final decades of a free plains culture fighting desperately against a rapidly changing world. And as each battle ended, the frontier itself transformed. Trails became railroads, hunting grounds became fenced ranches, and entire ways of life began disappearing into memory. Killing of a Texan settler. On the Texas frontier, violence often arrives suddenly. A rider on the horizon, smoke in the distance, or silence where there should have been noise. The killing of a Texan settler became one of countless tragedies that unfolded across contested land during the frontier years. But stories like this carried enormous emotional weight for settlers. These incidents reinforced fear of the frontier. Families lived isolated from one another, cabins stood miles apart, and protection could be far away. Every journey carried risk. At the same time, native communities faced growing pressure as settlers expanded into traditional hunting territory. The frontier became a collision of survival. Accounts surrounding the death of this settler describe sudden violence along a remote stretch of land. Whether traveling alone or defending a homestead, the victim became another casualty of the ongoing struggle consuming the region. News of such killings spread quickly. Frontier newspapers amplified fear, militias organized retaliation, and cycles of revenge deepened. But history often leaves out the larger reality. Violence existed on all sides. Settlements expanded into contested territory, military campaigns destroyed native villages, raids targeted civilians, and mistrust hardened across generations. For ordinary people caught in the middle, survival itself became uncertain. The killing of one settler may seem like a small story within the enormous history of the West. But to frontier communities, these moments shaped daily life. Parents worried constantly, travelers rode armed, and entire settlements carried the feeling that danger could appear without warning. The Texas frontier was never fully stable. It remained a place where hope and fear existed side by side. And every isolated tragedy became part of the larger story of the American frontier. Killing of a Texan settler. The Wichita Mountains Raid. Rising suddenly from the plains of present-day Oklahoma, the Wichita Mountains offered shelter, water, and defensive ground. For generations, native tribes used the region as refuge and hunting territory. But during the 19th century, the mountains also became tied to raids, military expeditions, and frontier conflict. The Wichita Mountains Raid emerged from that volatile era. War parties moved through rugged terrain difficult for soldiers to navigate. The mountains provided natural cover, narrow passes, hidden camps, and escape routes across harsh country. Settlers feared the region. To frontier communities, the mountains seemed to hide uncertainty itself. Military forces launched repeated campaigns attempting to stop raids and secure the territory. But the environment favored those who knew it best. Accounts of the Wichita Mountains Raid describe mounted fighters striking quickly before vanishing back into rough terrain. Supply wagons disappeared, ranches were abandoned, and rumors spread faster than facts. As with much of frontier history, stories grew larger over time. Some tales exaggerated numbers, others transformed local fighters into near-mythic figures. But beneath the legend remained a harsh truth. The southern plains were changing rapidly. The buffalo were disappearing, federal control expanded, and native resistance faced increasing pressure from military campaigns designed to force relocation.